One of the most important scientists in history is Galileo Galilei. If you asked any learned scientist who are the big three in physics, the answer is going to be Galileo, Newton, and of course good old Albert Einstein. And in the span of this class, we will talk about all three of these gentlemen. But we're going to start today and talk about Galileo. Galileo was an Italian gentleman born late 1500s, early 1600s. He was the son of minor league aristocracy, people who had a title but no money. And Galileo had a very stereotypical short redhead personality, fiery, kind of quick to temper, and also quick to a joke. He was very, very witty. People adored him. He kind of attracted people to him. And he is considered the father of the scientific method. Before Galileo existed, there was not a set down set of rules of what science did. And that scientific method is that observation, hypothesis, experiment, and of course then drawing some sort of a conclusion. This whole concept that there was a method of how you did science was new. Because remember, in the days of Aristotle, if they were trying to figure something out, they just sat around and thought about it. They actually didn't take data and analyze that data. Galileo was very, very popular with the rich and the famous. He hung out with the Medicis, which were the ruling family in parts of Italy during his time. He hung around with kings and princes, and coming from a moderately humble beginning, he did that because of his intellect and his wit. From an astronomy point of view, there were a couple of things that Galileo did that were a big deal. He was the very first person to make serious astronomical observations with a telescope. He did not invent the telescope. He read about it and he made his own version of it. This is an actual picture from a museum in Italy containing Galileo's actual telescope. The fancy stand came later. The telescope itself was actually quite simple and pedestrian and nothing too fancy. But by looking out into space with this simple telescope, he could see things that no one had seen before. One of the things he discovered was that the moon is rough. Now, if you remember the teachings of Aristotle, Aristotle said that the moon was smooth, and it was smooth because of the fact that its purpose was to reflect the light down from the heavens down to man. Well, Galileo looked at it, and these are actual drawings from one of Galileo's sketchbooks or data books. And night after night after night, he actually would sketch what he saw. And one of the things he saw was that there were craters. And how much of that crater was in shadow changed over time. Well, if you have shadows that are changing, that means that this crater is a three-dimensional structure. It has depth to it. That means Aristotle was wrong. The moon is not smooth. It's actually quite humpity-bumpity due to all of the craters. With the telescope, Galileo saw a whole bunch of stars not visible to the naked eye. Galileo's telescope was the same magnification power of about a pair of binoculars today, and not even a terribly expensive pair of binoculars. But if you have a small amount of magnification, you can see many times more stars than you can see with just the naked eye. The question was, why in the world would God put stars in the heavens that mankind could not see? This started causing some troubles with the old Aristotle idea of Earth being at the center of the universe and everything around us was for our purpose and our benefit. Galileo trained his telescope on Jupiter. And again, this is an illustration from Galileo's data. And what he noticed was night after night, he would see Jupiter, and then he would see little lights to the left and the right. And then the next night, the little lights will have moved to be in slightly different positions. And by charting these, Galileo came to the conclusion that, holy moly, Jupiter has moons. There are 4 large moons of Jupiter. They're known today as the Galilean moons of Jupiter. And you could see these with a simple pair of binoculars. You don't have to go buy a fancy telescope. And those 4 large moons of Jupiter are Io, Europa, Ganymede, and Callisto. Again, this caused a philosophical problem because at that point in time, they still believed everything orbited the Earth. And the question was, why would God have other planets orbiting something like Jupiter that was not the center of the universe? One of the most important things Galileo did was he discovered that Venus went through phases. Now, if the Earth was the center of everything, and Venus orbited us and the Sun orbited us, if this was a geocentric model, then the phases of Venus would look like this. We would see not all of the phases that it actually goes through. Galileo noticed that Venus goes through phases in exactly the same as our moon goes through. And the only way Venus's phases could be predicted is if the Sun was the center of the solar system and Venus orbited it and we orbit the Sun as well. So this was direct experimental evidence proving the heliocentric or sun-centered model. For many, many years, Galileo just hung out with the rich and famous. He invented some improvements on the telescope. And by his small little tinkering inventions, that's how Galileo actually made money. But later in his life, he decided it was time to actually write down what he had found in astronomy. And the book that he wrote is called The Dialogues on Two Great World Systems. And he wrote this as a conversation between 3 people, one representing the works of Aristotle, one representing the opinion of Galileo and Copernicus and Kepler to some extent, and the third man, a learned man, an intelligent man of the day. Now, why Galileo wrote it like this is because in the mid-1600s, there was a thing called the Inquisition. And the Inquisition was a court that was held by the Catholic Church. And the Catholic Church in Italy in the 1600s was very, very powerful. And they had actually proclaimed that the Earth is the unmoving center of the universe and everything revolves around us. If you did not believe that, you were in danger of being put on trial for something that is called heresy. And heresy is basically saying that what the church taught was wrong. So when Galileo wrote this book, he wrote it as a conversation so that the reader could make their own conclusions. But Galileo was very witty and kind of a smarty pants. And so the fellow who represented Aristotle, he named Simplicico. Now, if you say somebody is simple, today it is not a compliment on their intellect. You're basically saying that they're kind of stupid. And so Galileo couldn't help kind of thumbing his nose at authority and getting himself in trouble. In 1633, the Catholic Church said, okay, this guy is starting to get to be a royal pain. So they did arrest him. They took him from his home in Florence down to Rome, and they put him on trial. And they put him on trial in front of the Inquisition. Now, when they put him on trial for saying that the earth revolves and for teaching the Copernican view. Now remember, Copernicus died before any controversy could occur. By the time Galileo came along, Kepler was happily working on his stuff, and a lot of other people were doing this, but common people and the church still believed that the earth was the center of everything. Galileo was actually put on trial for believing crazy things like the earth goes around the sun. He was an old man. He was still quite respected, but they threatened him with torture. They did not actually torture him, but they put him in a cell, threatened him with torture, and eventually they convinced him that he needed to confess that he was wrong. And one of my favorite stories in science is that they wrote Galileo's confession. They brought this old, sick man, who by that time he was in his 60s, into the chamber to confess his sins. He kneeled down, he signed his name to the confession, basically saying, I was wrong, the earth does not revolve around the sun. And the story goes that as Galileo got up off his knees and was being escorted back out of the courtroom by his guards, he muttered under his breath, but it moves. So they may have convinced Galileo that he was wrong as far as paper goes, but his spirit was not squelched. As part of his punishment, Galileo was sentenced to house arrest for the rest of his life, and he was forbidden to do any more experiments or write any more works on astronomy or the heavens. And one of the reasons that I like Galileo and would love to sit down and have a beer with him sometime is after he was forbidden to write, he wrote one more book. And the book is called Discourses and Mathematical Demonstrations Concerning Two New Sciences Pertaining to Mechanics and Locomotion. This one book is the underpinning of the entire field of physics. Galileo dictated this book to his last mistress. Yes, Galileo got around a little bit. The book was snuck to Northern Europe and eventually published. That's our guy, Galileo.